much inspired by kind of Buddhist principles and has been heavily informed by it, as you'll see as we go along. So again, in both approaches, it's assumed that how you kind of view your thoughts, how you view your experience, how you view the world, plays an important role in kind of whether or not you experience stress. And more specifically, being someone, again, my specialty is conceptual processing, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Conceptual processing is perhaps at the heart of this, perhaps in both traditions. So that's why I'm especially interested in this. What kind of conceptual processing is involved that makes us feel stress? And in classic stress theory, the account of conceptual processing that has dominated thinking since the 80s and still pretty much dominates how people think about the cognition of stress is something called appraisal theory. And it basically says that how you think about a situation, how you kind of describe it to yourself, is kind of at the heart of whether you feel stress or whether you can relieve yourself from stress. And I think people still generally believe that kind of the basic idea behind this is right, but appraisal theory, when it was originally developed, was developed in kind of a scientific context that is no longer really present, or at least is changing rapidly. And so the way that appraisal theory was kind of formulated scientifically is no longer really a good fit with a lot of things that are happening in the field. So what I'm interested in is trying to kind of redevelop this approach and come up with a different account of cognition. It kind of has the same flavor as appraisal theory, but that kind of reflects some of these newer ways of thinking. And so the specific limitations that I kind of that I focus on the most with respect to appraisal theory is, first of all, it's cast within a theoretical framework that views the mind as a computer, that thinks about cognition as a very symbolic kind of activity of the kind of processing that takes place in a computer. And it's a very linguistically based account of kind of how you would think about a situation. And I think kind of in the current context, people don't really believe that the brain is as much like a computer as we once thought it, as we think that it's more of a biological system, and that cognition is heavily utilized, is what's called grounded. It uses your perceptual modalities, your body, your affective system much more heavily than appraisal theory would have assumed. In fact, it viewed kind of appraisals as separate from these things, especially from emotion. It's kind of the cause of emotion as opposed to part of it. And the other limitation of appraisal theory is it really wasn't designed to talk about the brain, neural activity, and in the current context, there's much more interest in trying to think about cognition from a neuroscience perspective, and so it would be nice to have a theory of the cognition and stress that reflects more of those kinds of assumptions. So basically, I'm going to tell you about this approach to thinking about the stress of cognition that my colleagues and I have been developing. And so this is going to happen in two parts. In the first part, for those of you who were at my talk yesterday, I apologize, this is going to be very much the same as an abridged version of what I talked about yesterday. I'm going to go through a grounded theory of concepts, and at this point I'm going to not talk about stress for a while. I'm just going to present this way of thinking about concepts. And then in the second half, I'll apply this theory of concepts to stress, and again try to capture the cognition that underlies stressful experiences, and also talk about some implications for treatment as well, very briefly. Okay, my collaborators, my main collaborators in this work are Lauren McDonough, a current graduate student, Esther Papias, a collaborator from Utrecht University, Lisa Feldman-Barrett at Northeastern University, and Chris Herzog at the Georgia Institute of Technology. And I'll point out their various contributions as we get to various parts of things. Okay, so I'm going to start telling you about this grounded theory of concepts, and so I first need to tell you what a concept is. And most basically, what concepts do is they represent categories that our brains create, categories in the world and categories in our experience. So, for example, we perceive this current situation as containing people and projectors tables and chairs, and there are, each of these things constitutes a category. We have a category of chair. There's a category of chairs that we perceive in the world, category of tables, people, projectors, and so forth. And our mind naturally kind of divides the world into these things. I'm not going to say anything about how we do that. I'm just going to assume that that happens. And then concepts are the representations that we have of these categories. So if we take the category of tables, for example, in our minds we've established a body of knowledge about what a table is that allows us to recognize them when we encounter them, and that allows us to draw inferences about how we can interact with them, how they'll behave in the world when we encounter them. And so concepts are fundamentally important to all of our cognitive activity. They constantly inform everything we do by kind of identifying what's happening around us, explaining what's going on, and then guiding our actions in response to what's in the world. In general, there's a huge literature on concepts and how to think about them scientifically. The most basic assumption that we need to make here is that a concept is aggregated information that your brain soaks up about a particular kind of thing. So your concept of table is is the information that your brain has extracted from your experiences with table. And I'll say a little bit more about possible ways to think about that aggregation process in the next few slides. So one basic aggregation process that I'm particularly interested in, and especially that I think has implications for thinking about stress, is the process of simulation. And so this is kind of the simulation mechanism that I'm going to describe in a moment. It's a mechanism that philosophers of mind have entertained for thousands of years as a basic way that the mind establishes knowledge about the world. And I'm just going to kind of present it in a modern neuroscience context. This would be a modern neuroscience version, but the basic idea has been around forever. But it's kind of gotten lost in the last 50 years of cognitive science. In appraisal theory, you don't see any ideas like this at all. It's a very different way of thinking about what a concept is that I'm not going to take time to describe. But basically what this is a mechanism for thinking about how concepts can form. So for example, imagine that you see this entity here. What happens, one part of the brain that becomes active as you encounter dogs in the world is that this part of the brain, kind of what's called the ventral stream toward the back of the brain along the underside, becomes active to produce a visual representation of what's out there in the world. So if you're seeing this entity, for example, and you're focusing your attention on it, it's going to extract information from this object that's going to be represented along this part of the brain, its color, its shape, its texture, and things like that. And this is widely accepted that this is what this part of the brain does, is it's producing visual information about what you're seeing. And from the simulation perspective, what happens is that the brain captures the state of activity in this part of the brain as you're seeing this particular dog, and stores it as a memory that can be used for later cognitive purposes. And imagine that this happens a lot. You see many dogs, this part of the brain typically becomes active to represent kind of how dogs look. And so you build up kind of a circuit in this part of the brain that helps you, that essentially captures how the brain responds whenever it sees a dog. And further imagine that this pattern of activity for seeing dogs gets linked up to hearing the word dog or reading the word dog, so that when you encounter the word dog, on later occasions, what happens if the dog is not present and you hear the word dog, what it does is it reactivates this part of the brain through this memory, this series of memories that's been captured in this circuit, so that your brain is kind of becoming active in the way it would normally be active if it were actually seeing a dog. So your brain is simulating visually the experience of what a dog would be like. In older philosophical theories, the idea was that you would have an image of a dog. We don't necessarily assume that in this approach. This kind of activity, when you simulate a dog, could produce a visual image, but a lot of modern scientists would assume that this kind of activity could occur unconsciously as well, so that you're kind of representing what a dog is out of awareness to yourself. We assume that these reenactments of experience or these simulations are not necessarily complete. It's not like you have a complete kind of visual experience of a dog being present. Instead, it could be sketchy, it could be partial, it could be distorted in some ways. It could be a reenactment of a particular dog, it could be a reenactment of an average dog. All sorts of different things are possible. But the main idea is that as you're thinking about what a dog is, the way you're representing your understanding of what it is by reactivating what the kinds of experiences you had when you encounter dogs.
Does it go on both sides of the brain? You've got the left side shown there.
Yeah, that's a great question. We would generally assume that most of this activity would be bilateral, but there could be some interesting hemispheric differences as a function. There are various theories of, about maybe the different kinds of information that are being processed in each hemisphere, but it's not those kinds of distinctions are not particularly critical to kind of where I want to take this. So this is a lot of evidence has been emerging in the last 15 years for this way of thinking about conceptual processing. And so I'm just going to show you a couple examples of experiments that demonstrate this. This is an experiment from my lab done with former graduate student Kyle Simmons. And what we were up to in this experiment was to kind of test this hypothesis that when you represent conceptual knowledge, you do so with simulation. And so the idea of this experiment is that if you think about what a leaf is, and you think about whether it's green, what this kind of theory would say, so you're doing conceptual processing, there's no leaf present, and so what this kind of theory would say is that the way you represent the greenness of a leaf is by reactivating the part of your visual system that represents color. So that you are kind of simulating the experience of green when you think about a leaf being green. And this again would break with kind of the current theories of conceptual knowledge, which would argue, as an appraisal theory, which would argue that you're representing green with some kind of symbolic structure that's very different and resides in a different system, say the system that actually perceives color when you perceive things in the world. So the idea again would be that you've seen green leaves, and when you thought about them being green, this activated parts of your visual system that process color, and then that sense of green became associated with the word for green, and so now when you see the word green, it's reactivating on this part of the brain that sees color. And so what we did in this experiment was participants were lying in this was in an fMRI scanner, and they are reading words like leaf and milk for, I believe it was 3 seconds. And after 3 seconds, a word for a color or an action comes up. And then they have to decide as quickly as possible whether or not that color or action correctly describes the previous object. So when green comes up following leaf, they would say true. And when green comes up following milk, they would say false. And what we do is we image their neural activity while they're processing green, and we separate it from the activity from when they were processing the original word for leaf or milk. And then we see whether or not the activation in the brain is taking place in the parts of the brain where you process color. And there would be many trials in this experiment with many different objects and many different colors, and then we kind of look at the average kind of brain activity across all of these different trials. So, and I guess, I don't have this on here, but at the end of the experiment, we actually showed them, we measured where the color processing areas in the brain actually are with a color perception task. So that we could see whether or not when they were processing these color words like green, whether they activated these color processing areas. And so this task that we used to identify the parts of the brain that process color, when we gave them this task, and I can tell you more details about this if you want to know how it's done, but these yellow areas are the areas of the brain that become active when you actually perceive color on the screen in front of you. And what you're looking at here, you're looking at the bottom of the brain. Here's the back of the brain here, here's the front of the brain here. And so the activation is occurring bilaterally along what's called the fusiform gyrus and actually into the posterior occipital areas as well. And these are classic color processing areas that are found not only in humans but in other primates as well. And so this task doesn't show anything new. We're just replicating what a lot of previous work has found, which is that color is processed in these parts of the brain. Then these blue areas are areas that were more active for the color properties than for the motor properties. So these are presumably the parts of the brain that are processing when they get a word like green, when they're processing the meaning or the conceptual knowledge that's associated with the word green or blue or red. And these activations tend to lie more in the left hemisphere, which is what you'd expect because that's where language is processed. And they tend to be more in the anterior parts of the brain, which become, say, more abstract and less perceptual. What we were interested in was whether there was any overlap between the areas that were active for processing these color words and for the areas that are active when people process color. And the largest area of activation in both tasks is this red area here. It was active both when people were perceiving color and when they were reading colored words. This is now a finding that's been replicated quite a few times. And what it indicates is that as you are thinking about a color word and you're thinking about its meaning, is you're representing it in your color system. There are other more recent experiments that have used slightly different tasks that activate even these more posterior, these earlier processing color areas. One other interesting finding is that these are the same areas that are active in macaque experiments for color as well. In fact, a study by Roger Tuttle argued that he thinks these more anterior areas of the color processing system are some of the most important and are actually more important for categorizing colors than for these earlier areas down
Are
here.
we looking at the brain from the bottom?
From the
up?
bottom, yeah, this is the bottom of the brain. Yeah. And then this is the back down here.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, this experiment offers evidence for the simulation view that when people are performing conceptual processing, that they're reactivating the parts of the brain that are active when they're actually perceiving things in the world. Here's one other experiment from Friedemann Pulvermüller's lab. This is an experiment where he had people listening to words that describe actions like lick, pick, and kick, and they're just simply listening to these words. And what he predicted was that as people hear these words, if the simulation account of conceptual processing is correct, that these words should activate the motor system. So what you're looking at here is a slice through the brain like this. And this would be the primary motor system. It's right kind of in the middle of the brain, and it is centrally involved in processing action. And one really interesting thing about it is it has what's called somatotopic mapping, which is that the top part up here, right about here, processes the bottom part of your body, like your feet and your legs, and the bottom part over here is processing the top part of your body, like your head. And so what Friedemann and his colleagues predicted was that if the simulation view is correct, not only should you see motor activation in these areas as you hear these words, when you hear a word like lick that involves a head action, you should see activations down here, whereas when you hear a word like kick, you should see activation more up here. And that's what he found, and others have found since. These are the results from the word task, where they're listening to the words. These blue areas are areas that are active for the leg words, the leg actions. The red areas are active for the arm actions, and the green areas are active for the head actions. So again, this supports the simulation view that kind of the way you represent conceptual knowledge about actions is by running simulations in the motor system. And again, there's now a tremendous amount of support for this kind of finding involving motor simulations and their role in conceptual processing. The next thing I want to talk about is situatedness. And this is another sort of modern theme in work on conceptual processing. And the idea is that when people perform conceptual processing, they don't do it in a vacuum. So when people think about what a dog is, if I say the word dog, you don't just kind of visually imagine a free-floating dog. Instead, you imagine a dog in some kind of context, in a particular setting like a park, with particular agents, objects, activities taking place, maybe mental states like awe, and so forth. But you kind of imagine yourself, you put yourself in a situation with the concept. And one reason we think that people do this is because it supports what we call situated action. That the conceptual system, it's not like an encyclopedia or a dictionary where you look stuff up, which is how it's often been thought in traditional theories. The conceptual system is more like an instruction manual. It kind of prepares you and it guides you for action with the concept in the world. And so by situating concepts in this way, the brain is preparing you for action in the world. And so for going back to this example earlier where I showed when you see dogs, it activates these visual processing areas. The idea here would be that all sorts of other areas that are active when you're experiencing dogs having to do with how they sound, the actions you perform on them, where you see them, the emotions you feel, and so forth, all of those get stored as well and linked to the word dog, so that later when you think about what a dog is, you think about a dog in a situated way. You think about, your brain is kind of situating the dog rather than just thinking about it in a vacuum. And so there's a lot of evidence for this. This is a very simple experiment done with former graduate student Ling Wu, where we simply gave people words for objects and had them describe the features of the objects. So like, what are the features of an apple? What are the features of a dog? And what we find is that, they don't just describe the object, which is what we ask them to do. They don't just describe legs, tail, ears, and fur. They describe the settings where you would find dogs. They describe the actions you would perform on dogs, how you would feel about dogs. And all of this information comes up very quickly. It's not like you first think about what a dog looks like and then get all this other situational stuff. All this stuff seems to come up as a package, suggesting that your brain is representing what a dog is in a situated manner. Here's an experiment from the lab of Alex Martin, done with former postdoc Linda Chow, which shows the same thing in a neuroimaging paradigm. What they did was to present people with pictures of manipulable artifacts like hammers, along with pictures of other things. And what they found was that when people were just looking at a manipulable artifact like a hammer, that a grasping circuit became active in the brain, that they imagined that not only did kind of visual areas process the visual information about a hammer that was being presented, the brain was representing the kind of action that you would perform on this object. Even though no action was shown, no agents were shown, nothing was said about using the hammer, but nevertheless, very quickly, within 3 seconds of seeing this hammer, and actually other experiments show it happens within hundreds of milliseconds, your brain is anticipating how you would interact with this object. And there are now dozens of both behavioral and neural experiments that show whenever you see an object that you would use for a function, your brain anticipates immediately the kinds of actions you would perform on it. And you can think of this as your brain situating these objects, that it's preparing you for a situated action with the object. Yes?
So the person doesn't have to be conscious of the hammer. Unconsciousness, that is, in tens of milliseconds, works. Is that correct?
I'm not sure anybody's done this with subliminal perception. It would be interesting to do. My guess is you would probably still see these effects. To look at things that fast, you probably couldn't do it in a neuroimaging experiment. We can't look at things that quickly. You could do it with ERP, but probably behavioral methods would allow you to look at it. But there are behavioral experiments that show very quickly on seeing an object that affords a certain kind of action, that your brain and your body are very quickly anticipating the actions to perform. But to my knowledge, no one's really looked at whether that can happen unconsciously. Yes?
I'm wondering if it would also hold true for creative applications. Like, everyone is familiar with that experiment where you put a hammer in the room and there's a string that's too far away, and that you give them the puzzle to put the strings together, and the thing that you're supposed to do is use the hammer in a non-typical way,
Right.
tie it on, swing it, and that's not situating the hammer, that's almost anti-situating a hammer.
Yeah, no, these kinds of effects would primarily be for familiar uses of things. And
So-
for novel uses, it would be a very different kind of processing mechanism.
So it would light up differently.
Yes, there would probably be a lot more frontal activity. You might still see activity in these areas as you imagine manipulating the hammer, but it would be a very different kind of activity.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, kind of the point of this is the fact that you immediately want to situate your conceptual knowledge. You don't think about a hammer in a vacuum. The task in some of these experiments is simply to name what you see. You don't have to think about using it, and yet you immediately situate the object. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is a construct of situated conceptualization, and this is a mechanism we're very interested in these days, and will be central to the account of stress that I'll be getting to in a moment. And this is work that Lisa Feldman-Barrett has contributed to a lot over the years. The basic idea is this, that the brain is essentially what we call a situational processing architecture, that it is designed to process the situations that we're in. So right now, we're in this space together, and there's a part of our brains that is processing the space. The fact that we're in a room where everything is next to us, there's a part of our brains that are just keeping track of all this spatial stuff. There's another part of our brain which is keeping track of all the objects in the room and what they are, and then linking together with the spatial system, situating them where they are. But there's another, like that ventral stream area that we looked at, is processing the objects around us. There's another set of areas that are processing all the agents in the room and processing their likely mental states, including myself. And then there's another set of areas that are processing actions and events that are taking place. And so you can think of the brain as containing distributed networks that are processing each of these different kinds of information. They're all operating in parallel, they're all operating all the time. They're all always giving you information about the situation. They're giving you perceptual information about how it looks, and also kind of conceptual information about what's out there. So I know that I'm having a perception of that person there, but I also conceptually know that it's Al, that it's a man, and so forth. And I left out a very important system here, especially for this talk, which is the self system. That self system is a major system in the brain, and it's constantly providing information about yourself, how you're thinking about yourself, and I think especially the implications of everything that's happening around you for yourself. And that's, I think, a really important system, especially as we get into stress. Okay, so all these systems are, just spewing out information in a constant stream as you're experiencing whatever situation you're in. And what a situated conceptualization is a complete package of all this stuff, and exactly how you want to bound it, when it begins and ends. That's a huge problem. I hear Jeff Zlaks was here. He's the world's expert on kind of how you would solve that problem, so I'm not going to say anything about it. But the basic assumption is that you're storing away records of situations that you're in, and they contain all of this perceptual and conceptual stuff that happens. We believe that there's a lot of levels of conceptual analysis that are taking place from the fact that there are, of what specifically is present, but also all sorts of relations among them, spatial, temporal, causal, intentional, that help you interpret what's happening in the situation. So a situated conceptualization is your conceptual interpretation of what's happening a period of time within a particular situation. We assume that these situated conceptualizations get stored away in memory once they're formed, and that you have zillions of them lying around in your brain. Exactly the form they're stored in is a really interesting, difficult question I'm not going to address or even much less try to solve. But the idea is that they're all in there to some extent, and at various points in time you can retrieve them. And that when you retrieve them, they want to kind of run as simulations in this. So all this conceptual activity that's taking place in all these streams of information, we assume is taking place is being captured using those simulation mechanisms I talked about earlier. And that later when you retrieve a situated conceptualization from memory from a past situation, so if you remember what you were doing earlier this morning, it starts running in your brain, running in your perceptual systems, in your motor systems, in your affective systems, in your self system. You start basically re-experiencing in your brain and in your body what was taking place. It's not just like an abstract description like you would read in a newspaper article. You're reliving it to some extent as the situated conceptualization becomes active. Now, we think that kind of one of the primary functions that situated conceptualizations enter into is what we call pattern completion inference. This is, I think, one of the most basic properties of brains of all species, all the way down to very simple organisms. They all do this. And the idea is that you've stored away these situated conceptualizations of these situations you've been in. And now as you wander into some new situation, your brain is trying to find the situated conceptualization that best fits it, that is the most suitable for kind of predicting what's going to happen here and how you should behave, how you should feel, how you should think, everything. And once it finds that best fitting situated conceptualization, it runs it and starts giving you inferences about what might happen next, what you should do, and so forth. So for example, if you walk into a room and you see a plate of brownies, that might activate a situated conceptualization of eating a bunch of brownies lately, and you start imagining how they taste, and you imagine the actions it would take to consume them, and you're kind of, even before you've reached out to grab a brownie, your whole brain and body has gone into a mode of what it would be like to consume them. And here's an experiment that supports this from my lab, done also again with Kyle Simmons as the lead author, where we showed people, it's very much like the hammer experiment I showed you a moment ago. We showed people pictures of high-fat, tasty, high-caloric foods, mixed in with pictures of buildings, and they were just, their task was to simply say whether the picture they were now looking at was identical to the previous picture. So it's a very simple visual processing, visual memory task. Nothing mentioned about taste, eating, action, or anything. But what we predicted is that when people see these highly tasty foods, that they're going to activate situated conceptualizations of consuming them. And that these situated conceptualizations would then produce pattern completion inferences that would run in places like your gustatory system, which your taste system, so that you would imagine what the food tastes like. And you might even imagine how rewarding or good it would be to consume it. There's actually a lot of evidence now, both neural and behavioral, to support that when you just see a pictured food, it triggers these kinds of responses. And that's what we found in this experiment. There was just a meta-analysis on this now, so there's a whole literature showing this kind of effect. But when you look at the food pictures as compared to the building pictures, it activates this part of the brain, what's called the insula. And we just found it on the right side, but it typically occurs on both sides for taste in more recent studies. But what's interesting about this activation, that our participants are just looking at pictures, they're not tasting anything. All these other activations indicated by these other indicators are activations that occur when people actually taste things. So you can drip things into people's mouths in a scanner and you can see what parts of the brain become active. And this part of the brain becomes active when you taste things. It also becomes active just when you look at a picture of a food. So and what we think is happening is you see the food, it pulls up a situated conceptualization of eating it, it runs a taste simulation as a pattern completion inference. Another thing that happens is that this part of the brain, the orbital frontal cortex, becomes active, and this is an area that's highly associated with when consuming a food is rewarding. And so what this indicates is that our participants were viewing these foods as being potentially rewarding. They were having the experience of them being rewarding, which again would be another pattern completion inference from seeing the foods. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about in this theory that will be relevant for the theory of stress is the construct of subjective realism. This is work I've done with Esther Papias and Ruud Kusters, and it was actually work done in Esther's lab at Utrecht, where Ruud was at the time. He's now moved to UCL. So what we are interested in this work is that when people run these simulations, like when a situated conceptualization becomes active, they seem real. It seems as if it's really happening. And kind of a couple pieces of evidence that are well documented in scientific literature is that if you show people pictures of tasty foods, you can actually detect increases in salivation. It's as if they are, I mean, the food, it seems sufficiently real to imagine eating it that they start salivating. Another really classic example is if you just imagine an emotional event, it's not actually occurring, you actually get emotional. Your body will start responding as if you were experiencing an emotion. So often when we imagine things, they seem very realistic. And when we get to stress, I mean, this is why stress can be so bad for you, is because your body really gets worked up about it, because you really, when you think about it, it seems very real. So my lab is very interested these days in what makes these simulations seem real. And this is a question that nobody in the field, to my knowledge, has asked. We really have no insights about it at all, what kind of mechanisms kind of make these simulations seem real. Now, Buddhism has been talking about this for thousands of years, and they're very clear that it's all about conceptual processing. It's the conceptual apparatus that you bring to bear to your mental states that causes these thoughts you have to seem so real that you suffer from having them. And there are a variety, from a scientific perspective, there are a variety of candidate systems that could be involved in making these things seem real, like the system that processes self, systems that process space and time, the systems that process action and emotion. But the idea is that when you're running these simulations, all these specific systems are kind of making it seem as if you're actually in the real situation, as if you're spatially there, as if you're physically there, as if you're carrying out the actions and feeling the emotion, and as a result, it seems real. So that's one thing we're very interested in. One of my students is doing her dissertation at the moment on trying to kind of get take a first pass at trying to identify what some of the mechanisms are that make these simulations seem real. But another question we can ask is, how can we take the subjective realism out of these simulations, especially in situations where it isn't good for you to experience subjective realism? And of course, Buddhism is all over this. This is kind of what meditation practices are all about. It's what the construct of emptiness is heavily about, that it's like taking the realness out of your thoughts so that you see them for what they are, just conscious mental states. And so we've been very interested in understanding what happens when this occurs and what it takes to make it happen. And so Esther is a food researcher, very interested in understanding kind of why people eat, what causes them to eat when they do, what happens in various kinds of eating disorders. And what she had been studying before we started this work was kind of when you see a food, how you generate these simulations of eating them, and then how these simulations drive your behavior, how they kind of motivate you to consume the food, even when you probably shouldn't. And so what the idea we came up with at one point was, well, we wondered if mindfulness could take the subjective realism out of these, what she was calling at the time, hedonic eating simulations. You see a food and you imagine the hedonic pleasure of consuming it. And so she came up with this 12-minute procedure that she used with non-meditators, where she simply brought Utrecht undergraduates into the laboratory and showed them tasty food pictures like the ones I've been showing you, like the one on this slide, and said, you're going to have these hedonic responses to them. You're going to imagine eating these things, and it's going to taste really good. And I want you to kind of just shift your perspective on it and just see these mental states you're having. It's just mental states. You're not really eating it, it's just a mental state. And she had them do this for 12 minutes. And then we took them into another task that Rude developed, and what's called an implicit social cognition task, and I can tell you more details about it if you want to know, but basically the main thing you need to know is that it measures automatic, very rapid impulses, like that happen on the order of 200 or 300 milliseconds. But social psychologists are very clever at developing these methods to pick up these kind of implicit processes you're not even aware of, and this was something that we developed. And so what basically happens is that if you take the control participants in our experiment who didn't do this mindful attention procedure and you show them attractive foods, they will show impulses on this task that Ruth developed. And what we've now found in almost a dozen experiments is that when you do this 12-minute mindful attention intervention, it eliminates these impulses. Now when you show people pictures of tasty food, they no longer show impulses. Esther recently did an experiment in one of the Utrecht cafeterias where she had people do this manipulation before going and buying lunch, and they bought fewer unhealthy snacks after just doing this for 12 minutes. So it's possible to take the subjective realism out of these simulations, which is something we're very interested in both for eating, and also clearly has a lot of potential for stress that people like John Kabat-Zinn have realized for a long time. Yes.
But the visual system is still active in these cases, or is it something later than the visual system?
These experiments are behavioral. We have a grant proposal out where we would very much like to image these tasks and see exactly what's active. But I think, my guess is we'll see visual activation, but I think what's going to change, what our hypothesis is that mindful attention is like decreasing those activations in the gustatory and reward areas. And also, our experiment didn't find this, but a lot of the subsequent experiments have found an amygdala activation when you see a tasty food, which is kind of associated with impulsiveness toward the food. So we think that this training might decrease amygdala responses as well. Okay, so that's kind of this grounded theory of concepts that we've been working on for maybe the last 20 years. Now kind of we're getting interested in trying to see whether we can apply it to the cognition of stress. And so that's what I'm going to do in my remaining time. And so the first thing that I want to do is just make a few kind of initial arguments about conceptual processing of stress. And again, the assumption in both Buddhism and in modern clinical sciences that stress results from a certain kind of cognitive activity, and specifically a certain kind of conceptual analysis of things. And in Buddhism, this is captured with the three kleshas, or the three poisons, or the three roots of suffering. And the first klesha is that we are under the illusion that we have a self, that there's a real self inside of us that's kind of permanent and enduring, very almost like an object. I sometimes wonder if like the ventral stream is somehow making us think that self is a permanent, enduring object with clear boundaries and so forth. But kind of the idea, kind of this first poison is because we have this self that we are so concerned about that we then get very interested in managing and looking out for its well-being, and that this in turn produces the second two kleshas, attachment and aversion, that we try to get things that we think are going to make this self better, and we try to avoid things that are going to make this self worse. So is my understanding of kind of how Buddhists would view kind of the conceptual processing that is producing suffering and stress as a subset. And interestingly, in the stress literature, very similar ideas were developed, I think, independently especially by Richard Lazarus in the classic work that he developed on appraisal theory in the 90s, where he essentially argued that whenever somebody is stressed, they're experiencing a threat to self. That's almost a necessary condition for stress to occur. Now, kind of hardcore stress researchers can point out other kinds of stress where this isn't always the case, but generally speaking, I think most people would agree that stress occurs when you feel under threat to some extent. But Lazarus also noted a second condition for stress to occur, because if you feel under threat but you can handle it, you don't feel stress. And that's what he called the challenge. When you feel stress, it's because you don't feel like you can handle it. And so I like to think of this in Buddhist terms as an aversion failure, that you are not able to kind of avert yourself successfully. You can't get away from this threat. And you're kind of stuck with it, and so you start ruminating about it. And it starts driving you crazy because it's unresolved. You can't handle it. So in work that I've been developing with Lisa Feldman Barrett and Chris Herzog and Laurie McDonough, we've been interested in kind of trying to develop kind of a more modern theory of the conceptual structure of stress. And in this first part, and especially at this cut, it looks very much like Lazarus's original theory, which is that there's some actual or imagined event And you have some expectations about how the world should be, which are heavily tied to self. And when you notice certain kinds of discrepancies, sometimes those discrepancies between what occurs and what you expect introduce a threat to self. You think that some of your interests are at stake, and then if you don't think that you can handle them, then you experience stress. So this would be kind of essentially what I've already been describing for Lazarus. And we would view these as kind of core categorizations that occur as kind of stressful experiences becoming started. Now, we also believe, however, that there's more. So what Lazarus believed was that you would make these appraisals and then they would activate like discrete emotions like fear or anxiety or anger. But we have a slightly different way of thinking about things, which is that that basically a stressful experience is an entire, and this is again coming from a grounded perspective, that a stressful experience is really a situated conceptualization. It's everything that's taking place in a situation where you're experiencing stress. And so you certainly have like all these core conditions for stress that are occurring, but then they in turn are going to produce various kinds of peripheral physiological responses, which a lot of people believe are designed to help you cope with the situation, to energize your body in certain ways to handle what's going on. Often negative emotion, typically negative emotion gets generated as well. And kind of you can think of what's one reason that all of this is happening is your body's trying to alert yourself to the fact that something's important is happening that you need to deal with. Again, maybe trying to mobilize your activity, maybe trying to tell you something about yourself, or your state that you need to address more specifically. But then once you have a sense of what's going on in the situation, then you try to deal with it in various ways. You may perseverate. This is a very classic thing that occurs when distressed, or you may ruminate. You rehearse or you keep running this simulation over and over again. And here we would say what you're doing is you're running the same situated conceptualization. It's not over and over again. You're not just kind of symbolically representing it. You're imagining yourself in the event. It's subjective realism, and it's producing all this stuff in your body, the physiological responses that are going to really produce wear and tear. And you're also kind of doing other various kinds of kind of cognitive processing, kind of meta-level processing about what's happening, trying to think about what you're doing, whether this is a good or a bad thing. And then you're also trying to cope with the situation, which could involve things ranging from motoric responses to various kinds of cognitive processes as well. I guess I have that over here. But so basically what we think a stressful experience is it typically includes all of these different kinds of activity, and that situated conceptualizations are being formed to kind of perceive and conceptualize all this that get laid down every time you experience stress. And I'll say more about how we think that enters into these pattern completion inferences in a second, but first I just want to tell you briefly about a study we performed to test this theory, to see if this was a reasonable way to think about how people conceptualize their stressful experiences. And so what we did was we had a group of 12 participants. It took them about, I think, 40 hours to do. We got a list of 600 events, almost 600 events. And we had them rate how the one-sentence descriptions of events, all related to kind of college life, like your professor just accused you of cheating, or your roommate is telling stories about you to your friends that aren't true, things like that. And we would have them rate them, first of all, for how stressful they would find this. And they did all these ratings were done in different blocks at different times on different days, so to kind of reduce what we call collinearity between these measures, even though we found huge amounts. So they would judge the stressfulness of the experiences on one day. On another occasion, they might judge, all this would be randomly mixed up, just kind of how much this event would violate their expectations about what should occur in the world. They would rate how much perceived self-threat they experienced, how much they thought they could cope with the activity, the negative emotion they would experience, the extent to which they would experience peripheral physiological responses, the certainty that they would be able to find something eventually to cope with the situation, and how much perseveration they would have. And basically, what we found was that this kind of conceptual structure of stress that we developed did a great job of explaining, of predicting stressfulness. So basically, as an event became more stressful, there was a greater violation of expectations, greater perceived self-threat, lower efficacy, which is why the correlation is negative, greater negative emotion, greater physiological responses, more perseverative thought, and decreased kind of hope that they would eventually come up with a coping behavior. So basically, all of these things seem to be central parts of kind of how people think, represent and experience stressful experiences. This was almost really more of a pilot study. We're kind of interested in doing some more ambitious things. We also use multi-level modeling, which allows us to look at individual differences, and there were lots of really interesting individual differences suggesting that how people conceptualize stress very significantly across individuals, something else we're interested in looking at. Okay, so I'm almost done. So basically, again, what we think happens is that as you're experiencing stress, you're kind of processing all these different aspects of conceptual experiences, and they're getting laid down in these memories that we call situated conceptualizations of the stressful experience. And that to the extent you experience the same kind of stressful situation over and over again, you lay down a large population of that kind of stressful experience. And as a result, different people, because they experience stress differently, different stressful situations, lay down different populations of these things. So one thing that we like about this approach is that it allows us to capture individual differences in stressful experience. And from a Buddhist perspective, we kind of think of this as karma. If you think of kind of karma as your conditioning that determines how you think and behave in a subsequent situation, the idea is that it's these things, these situated conceptualizations that you're capturing and laying down that later become active and control your subsequent reactions to stress. So and that's illustrated in this slide here, which is, so once you have this large population of situated conceptualizations lying around in memory, so let's say you were recently in a minor fender bender somewhere around town, and it was rather stressful. I mean, you were worried about whether something was hurt initially, and then you were worried about all the hassle and all the disruption in your life, and it just violates your expectations about what should happen in the world. Pretty stressful experience, and let's say, a couple weeks later you're driving down the street and you almost get in an accident, and and what happens is that situation pulls up these situated conceptualizations from the previous experience where you were actually in that accident, and it just starts running, and for the rest of the day you're a mess because these things have taken over your brain and your body. And so this is what we think a lot of what happens in stress is that the way you condition your cognitive system through how you process situations is laying down memories. And then in later situations, you start pulling this stuff back up, and it affects your experience. So yeah, basically when you pull these things up, they influence how you interpret the current situation. They can produce rumination, and again, we would assume there would be significant individual differences in how this happens. The last thing I want to talk about is just implications for interventions. I think there are three classic ways of approaching stress, I think from both the Western and Eastern perspectives. And I think this approach that I just described is very compatible kind of for working with stress with each of these three strategies. So one kind of strategy is what you might think of as cognitive restructuring, kind of changing the conceptual analysis that you do of situations. And in the Western world, cognitive behavioral therapy is all about changing cognitive structure so that you re-experience the world differently. In Eastern traditions, Lojong and Lamrim traditions, I think, are heavily about the same kind of thing, of creating new conceptual structures so that you interpret things differently. But I think in both cases, if you look at actually how these structures get built up, they're often built up in ways that kind of create situated conceptualizations while you're practicing or while you're doing the therapy or whatever, so that later in subsequent situations you have these situated conceptualizations to pull up. And my suspicion would be that the closer you can make your practice to this, and I think probably a lot of evidence would support this, the more effective they're going to be, because they will then fit the situations that are relevant when they later apply. Another common way to kind of deal with stressful situations is antidotes, where kind of the idea is to think of something else that will block the problematic way of thinking. And again, I think you can think about this from a situated conceptualization perspective. The problem is you've got a situated conceptualization running that's a problem, and the trick, and this is kind of the way we're thinking about emotion regulation these days, as you try to think of a different situated conceptualization, you can pull up that will compete and drive out the other one. And then finally, there's the mindful attention approach, which is increasingly used in Western clinical work, as well as, of course, central to Eastern approaches. But again, the way that I think we would think about this is that rather than trying to replace or push out a conceptual kind of type of problematic conceptual processing, it's just, the goal here is just to diffuse it, to just kind of take down the conceptual processing, to deactivate it, so that it no longer it kind of creates kind of the negative emotion and stress on the body that we're trying to avoid. Okay, so basically what I've covered is, first of all, I've started with a grounded theory of concepts, and then suggested that it might provide a useful way of thinking about stress and the cognitive and conceptual processing that's taking place in stress. And again, this is like a preliminary proposal at this point. We have one almost just pilot study testing it. Something we're interested in developing in our future work. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts of any kind, I'd love to hear about them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.